You're watching Knowledge and Wisdom, where we explore the depths of history, theology, philosophy, archaeology, and beyond. If you're curious to uncover truth and insight across time, this is the place for you. Did a show talking about some situations with some surveys about what priests believe about homosexuality. And I made a comment there that somebody asked me about in the comment section. I thought, okay, you know what? I probably should show this documentation because I don't think most people are aware of this. I was talking about the Jerome biblical commentary. In this particular case, the new Jerome biblical commentary, second and also third edition. This is a commentary that is probably one of the most prominent academic, scholarly biblical commentaries. Whether you're Catholic or not, this is usually one of the standards. However, it is incredibly controversial. There's a lot of things in there that I think a lot of people would say is just incompatible with Catholicism or even Christianity, broadly speaking. And so there's a lot of stuff in there that, is hotly debated. But within academic circles, scholars tend to actually affirm the things that are in there, right? So there's often that tension between dogma, what the church teaches, and what scholarship is saying, and what the even Catholic biblical scholars are saying. And so it tends to have that infamous reputation for that reason. And I think you might see that in what I'm about to show you. As I mentioned, the new Jerome biblical commentary, in some way approved by Pope Francis, we could say, not necessarily like in his magisterium, giving some kind of official magisterial approbation, but approved by writing a really strong and favorable forward to the most recent edition, and saying very, again, favorable things about it, which triggered a lot of people when it happened. A lot of people were really concerned, like, what in the world? How could a pope approve of anything in this? It's just so at odds with Catholic dogma in many cases. And so I mentioned that, and I mentioned that in relation to the survey that indicates a lot of priests don't believe that the Bible is inerrant, right? They think it has errors. And I said, I'm not surprised, because the most prominent biblical commentary, and really Catholic biblical commentary, even though it's usually used by everyone, not just Catholics, is just very outright in saying that there's contradictions in the Bible. And I mentioned how it argues that Jesus contradicts Paul, or Paul contradicts Jesus. You know how you look at Jesus in Matthew 5, and he talks about how I came not to abolish the law. Paul in Ephesians, assuming, again, Pauline authorship, scholars want to debate that, but again, assuming Pauline authorship for Ephesians, Ephesians explicitly says the law has been abolished. So people are like, wait, is this a contradiction? Jesus says that I came not to abolish the law. Ephesians explicitly says it's been abolished. Jesus says that you have to keep the law for salvation. Paul talks about how we can't keep the law for salvation, putting him in tension with, in the minds of these scholars, Jesus and Moses. Moses in Deuteronomy talks about how the law is very near to you, and it's easy to do it and fulfill it. So scholars tend to look at that and they'll say there's a contradiction, which is what the New Jerome Biblical Commentary is saying. But then it says something else after that, and I mentioned it. And I think it shocks most people, and rightly so. I think it should shock most people. It says that Jesus's understanding of the law and of the faith was subverted by Paul and Pauline Christianity, but Jesus's version was reasserted later on, centuries later, in Islam. In other words, Islam is the fulfillment of what Jesus taught, and what we have today is not what Jesus taught. It's what Paul taught that contradicted Jesus, and it's Muslims who are preserving and keeping Jesus's understanding of the law. That's what it argues. And it's shocking to see a Catholic commentary saying that so explicitly. And it's not just an offhand comment, it's drawing on the scholarship of a lot of Catholic and other non-Catholic Christian commentators, researchers who argue that, right? There's an entire field of scholarship kind of dedicated to the subject of what was Jesus's understanding of the faith, and was it preserved later on by any of the Christian churches? And a lot of scholars have begun to argue that, it was corrupted in all of the Christian churches, but Islam revived it. And that's the Muslim claim, right? That is very clearly what Muslims teach, that the true revelation given to Moses and given to Jesus was corrupted in part by Jews and Christians, but Muhammad and Islam restored and fulfilled it. So that's the Islamic claim. So by stating this position, I don't know how they could maintain that and not be Muslim, right? I'm left scratching my head thinking, is this a Muslim biblical commentary, or is it, what's going on here? And the Pope's approving this? This is interesting. Okay. So lest you think I'm making this up, I always have receipts. Y'all know that by now. Let me show you. I have the actual physical edition, but I'll show it to you online.
Hey, sorry for the interruption. This is a patron-only show that I'm making available to everyone to see. And I'm sharing it because I want you to see that I post plenty of extra content for patrons only. So if you want access to exclusive videos that I'm posting, go and check me out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology, or hit the join button right here on YouTube. All right, let's get back to the video.
These verses give the basic legal principles of the Sermon on the Mount. They are the most controversial verses in Matthew, and there is no consensus on their interpretation. The interpreter must try to state the problem clearly and to provide a historically honest judgment, even at the price of theological tidiness. So, in other words, they're saying if you're going to be honest with the text, you're going to be saying things that some people are going to consider unorthodox or heretical. The problem arises because the plain sense of the words is that Jesus affirms the abiding validity of the Torah so that it would endure. But this contradicts Paul. And then they cite Galatians 2:15, 16, Romans 3:21 through 31. So they are just outright saying contradiction here on the question between Jesus and Paul on the law. Moreover, no major Christian church requires observance of all 613 precepts of the Old Testament law, ethical and ceremonial, but only the ethical commands such as the Decalogue and the commands to love God and neighbor. And even with the Decalogue, there's some debate on the Sabbath, right? Thus, there is a gap between the teaching here and the teaching and practice of the churches. So, I mean, they're just outright saying that effectively the churches have corrupted Jesus's message. Right, which again is the Muslim claim. So this is why it's just so surprising to see Catholic and other non-Catholic Christian scholars and contributors to the commentary saying this. This is just like, well, why not Islam then, kind of thing, right? Thus, there is a gap between the teaching here and the teaching and practice of the churches. The position adopted here is the following. There are contradictions within the New Testament on penultimate matters, so secondary matters. This is not necessarily a disadvantage, since it should widen Christian tolerance of variety within the church and help ecumenism. So Hans Kung and others have argued that Christianity is actually much more diverse than the churches today allow. And they'll point to the diversity of the earliest churches. And yes, in the earliest period, there was a radical amount of diversity. There were some Christians that were saying some things that really sound like what Muslims are saying. They're considered heretical by later generations, but you find that. You also find some that were very much Judaizers and very much looked a lot like what we would describe as maybe um, Messianic Judaism in some ways, although there's a lot of diversity there. There's some elements that you would argue is not in line with any of that, and is the seed form of what we see developed into Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and all that, right? So there is a diversity, and they're pointing to that, and they're saying the church is no longer allowing for those diversities, but us restoring this understanding should broaden our horizon and realize that this actually helps with ecumenism, because they're talking about interreligious dialogue, not just within the churches. And then they're referencing Hans Kung, very controversial figure, denied papal infallibility, in fact. And so he was, I think, Ratzinger, although they were good friends. Hans Kung, by the way, was at Second Vatican Council as one of the theologian advisors there, as was Ratzinger and Karl Rahner. They're all friends. And later on, Ratzinger had to be the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, and kind of put Hans Kung through a heresy trial, if you will, and ended up just removing him. They never excommunicated him, but just removed him from his teaching position in the Catholic University. Okay. Historically, Matthew and James inclined more to the Jewish Christian side of early Christian polemic, though Matthew is clearly open to the Gentile mission. Yet he never mentions circumcision, the most divisive issue between Paul and James, though he may presuppose it as desirable, even if not absolutely necessary. Moreover, Matthew 5:21-48 does not discuss ceremonial precepts in detail, but concentrates on the ethical. There are two common exegetical strategies for evading the plain meaning. Reinterpretation. Excuse me, let me cough here. Sorry, I didn't want to cough in your face. Reinterpretation. So in other words, they're saying there's a couple ways to Bible-splain this, to use that phrase that people like to say whenever you're dismissing the plain sense of the word and coming up with excuses or whatever, right? They're arguing this is Bible-splaining. They're arguing that, people are ignoring the reality that there's a contradiction between Jesus and Paul. And so to make sense of that, to harmonize things, to try to avoid the contradiction, they have to either, number one, reinterpret, especially through verse 18, but 23, or just deny authenticity. Just say that, this isn't actually part of the original Gospel of Matthew. Or I guess vice versa, right? This wasn't actually part of Paul or something. This latter approach contains much truth, it says. That's interesting. Apart from verse 18, the verses are probably post-Paschal and reflect the outlook of Jewish Christianity, which as a separate movement was eventually defeated by Paulinism, Paul's version of Christianity, and died out. So it argues that some of these earliest groups that we know existed in the first century were very much Jewish Christians in some cases, held to a keeping of the law, denied the virgin birth, all sorts of, there's a wide variety here, right? Some of them denied the crucifixion. And some of them said you have to continue sacrifices and all sorts of stuff. Oddly enough, we find Paul engaging in those sacrifices after the resurrection. Be that as it may, they're saying those forms of Jewish Christianity died out because Pauline Christianity was mostly Gentile, and most people don't want to get circumcised and keep the Sabbath. So Gentiles are going to gravitate towards a more you don't have to keep the law gospel, versus a claim that you got to get circumcised as a grown man and now keep the law and all these inconveniences. And so, the idea here is that the success of Paul was because he was offering a different version of Christianity that was easy on Gentiles. And so it spread all over very quickly. But that basically killed Jewish Christianity. And then it says, perhaps to be reborn in a different form as Islam. And then they cite quite a few documents here, right? by some pretty prominent scholars, Danilo, for example. Um, wasn't he a Paridi at Vatican II as well? I think, and then Shops. Um, now, on this point, that's what Muslims claim, right? They claim that Jesus's version of Christianity died out to Paul because Paul's version corrupted that message. And so the original message was corrupted, but later on revived in Islam. So that's 100% the Muslim claim. This is why I say it makes no sense as a Catholic or just broadly speaking Christian biblical commentary to argue this. It would just be like arguing that somehow all of the divinities that you find in Hinduism are manifestations of the Holy Spirit, like in one way or another. They're manifestations of God the Father or something. You know, they're just by different names or something. Which I think Hans Kuhn, in one of his works where he's talking about Islam and Christianity and how Christianity can accept the, I think he argues that it can accept the Quran and Muhammad as a prophet. I kid you not. Hans Kuhn argues this. I forget which book it's in. But he also talks about Hinduism and Buddhism. And I think he talks about a lot of overlap between Christianity and Hinduism. So maybe he says something wild like that there in the Hindu part. I don't know. but it would be as wild as saying something like that, right? That's not what you would expect a Christian to say. And frankly, I don't know how you can embrace that view and remain a Christian. I don't think you can. I think that you would either have to live with extreme cognitive dissonance or just pick a lane. Like pick one of the two at that point. I don't think that you can hold both of those together. Right. I don't think that you could still say, well, I affirm, any of the churches today, but also affirm that Jesus's version of Christianity was, revived in Islam or something. I don't know how you would make that work. That doesn't seem to be very coherent, right? This is what I'm saying. Seeing this kind of stuff approved at really all levels, we see it used by the vast majority of biblical scholars, Protestant or Catholic, so Catholic or non-Catholic. And then we see the clergy using it. We see the Pope writing a foreword to the thing, highly praising it. How does that work? You don't believe me? I mean, look right here. Jerome Biblical Commentary for the 21st century. Right here, Pope Francis, this is just part of it. There's a whole longer forward. The Word of God unites believers and makes them one people. This is the importance and mission of biblical scholarship. At the service of the community of faith, the type of scholarship exhibited in this volume of biblical commentaries. He's saying, and again, this is just an excerpt. There's a lot more. He wrote a whole foreword to it. But here he's saying this commentary is a perfect example of scholarship at the service of the church. How? To me, that just looks like a pipeline to Islam. I don't know how that's at the service of the church. But it's this internal contradiction that I constantly see. And this internal contradiction being the magisterium is saying something, but then it's not being preserved and backed up in the private opinions of popes, cardinals, and bishops. It's incredibly, I think, contradictory and confusing. And so a lot of people, again, when they saw him write this forward and give this kind of approval, a lot of people were scandalized because there's a whole bunch of other stuff in there, denying all sorts of dogmas of the church. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there that just isn't compatible with Catholicism. So a lot of people were just really scandalized by that. Anyways, that's what I was referring to. So for those of y'all who are asking, there it is. I know it's hard to believe. I first heard of it from actually a Muslim scholar. And I was like, what in the world are they talking about? And so I had to go and look it up. I was like, there's no way. What in the world? So Muslim scholars actually point this out in biblical scholarship and also early church scholarship. And they'll point out scholars who are making those claims that they would interpret as, favorable to Islam. So that's where I heard of it.
Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/reason of theology.